Small confession, I had heard of Wendigos before, but I'd never really looked into them before I started researching for this video. Oh my god, how horrifying! The mimicry, the cannibalism, no thank you. And while doing all that research, I found 2 of the most terrifying Wendigo stories. So hold on to your teddy bears as we go deep into the Wendigo. Brian and Dave are 10-year-old boys outside playing around on a relatively warm northern Minnesota day in February. It's 1972, so there are no computers or cell phones, so the boys are outside just looking for something to capture their attention. And they find it. They're out walking down this old fire lane and they cross this frozen bog, and on the other side, they see a nice steep hill. And the boys look at each other with a spark of adventure in their eyes and say, "We can go sledding!" So they start scrambling to the top as fast as their snow boots will take them. And when they get up there and look around, they see next to them is another steep hill. So they start climbing to the top of that one. And when they get up there, they look around, and at another angle, again, is a third steep hill. And they are in hog heaven. They look at each other and they know this is going to make the most epic luge run ever. And it was about 20 degrees that day, so the snow was just a little bit sticky and melty. Perfect for snow construction. So they spent all afternoon making this awesome sledding run with curves and embankments going from the top of the third hill to the bottom of the first hill. But when they're done, they decide it's actually a little bit too warm outside to use it. If they try to use it now, the snow is too soft, and as they go around the corners, it's just going to bust apart. They have to wait for a day that's much colder. It needs to freeze. That will make the track really fast. 2 days later, the temperature is now 20 below zero. Welcome to a Minnesota winter. When they remember their sled run, and they both agree, let's go sledding. It's super cold. It's Friday. School's out. We have the rest of the afternoon. So they put on all their cold weather gear, grab their sleds, and go back out to their Triple Hill Luge Run. And the Luge Run does not disappoint. It is fast and it is crazy. Each of the boys makes 2 runs down the hill. And Brian can't remember who got to go first, but as it works out, when one is at the top, the other one is about halfway up the second hill. So when that person goes down, the next one is at the top of the hill. So they can just go back and forth all afternoon. And as Brian gets to the top for the 3rd time, he sets down his sled and, like a pro, surveys the 5 or 6 foot rut that leads to the edge of that big, steep first hill. But before he sits down on that sled to push himself to the point of no return, he takes a look around at what's at the top of that hill. And he's kind of looking around, and he looks behind him, and all that's really up there are a few barren hardwood trees, mostly smaller ones, a few poplars, and one big black spruce tree that's about 40 feet behind him. And he turns back around and he's about to jump on his sled, but something about what he just saw doesn't seem right. So he turns his head back and looks again. Now, he's 10 years old. He's not that observant. He's like, something just looks different. And something in the back of his head says, that's just not right. It's not right. So he turns all the way around and looks closer. And by golly, it's not right. The black spruce should have only 1 trunk, not 3. And those 2 extra trunks have fur on them. Well, hair. Really long hair. Long gray hair. What's got long gray hair? Are there some kind of snow pants that have long gray hair or something? It's gotta be somebody pranking me. So he looks up a little higher to where a teenager or maybe an adult head should be, like maybe 5 or 6 feet up off the ground. He doesn't see anything, just branches. Then Brian notices rustling coming from the tree a little higher up, about 3 more feet up. So he looks up a little higher, and at 9 feet, he sees a face looking down at him with its hands holding the tree branches apart. something is looking down at him with a wide open mouth grin. Its face doesn't even look remotely human. It has a flat nose with two little slits for nostrils, a thick brow ridge, and a receding forehead. But he can't really see the top of its head because of the branches. But when it grins, he can see all of its teeth. It has upper and lower canines, and all of them are sharp. And Brian turns around and he jumps on his sled and he starts heading down that hill as fast as he can. He's surprised he didn't melt the snow or start the hillside on fire. And at this moment, he doesn't even care if he flies off the embankment and kills himself or hits a tree. That's irrelevant. He just needs to get away from the monster. And as he's flying down the hill, about halfway down, Dave is on his way up and sees Brian coming. Dave doesn't even hazard a guess as to what is going on. He sees Brian's blood-drained face and bulging eyes as Brian yells, "Run like hell!" So as soon as Brian whooshes by, Dave drops his sled on the run and starts heading down the hill right behind him. And the next thing Brian remembers, he's back at his house 3 miles away. And he's just standing there thinking, where's Dave? I'm not waiting for Dave. Why am I waiting for Dave? He had hysterical amnesia and forgot about the entire incident for 2 years. Until Dave has this little gathering with Brian and 3 or 4 other friends. And Dave says to Brian, "Remember that time we went sledding out at the end of the fire lane?" And Brian says, "No." And Dave says, "Yeah, remember we went out walking across that bog and we found those steep hills, 3 of them stacked up?" And Brian's like, "No." And Dave goes, "Yeah, you were coming down the hill really fast and you said run like hell." Boom! It all came back. And for like a month, Brian wouldn't talk to Dave because the whole thing was so traumatic. Because when you're 10 years old and you see a 9-foot predatory monster that after decades of researching and studying turns out to be a Wendigo, that's not a comforting thing. And just so you know, Brian sees bears all the time. He lives like a mile from the county dump. There are 3 or 4 of them in his yard every week in the summer. So it's not like he mistook what he saw for a bear. And this was the middle of winter, 2nd week of February, 20 below zero. So bears aren't going to be up and wandering around anyway. Plus, bears are not 9 feet tall. And Brian says that once you've had an experience like this, that it also ruins your belief in authority figures and in your parents who always told you there were no such thing as monsters. Because look, there's a friggin' monster right there. Don't tell me there's no such thing as monsters. The writer of this story says that due to the nature of the encounter, she prefers to remain anonymous, but instead uses the pen name Alex. On September 13th of 2016, Alex is driving up the Bighorn Mountains outside of Buffalo, Wyoming. Just like every other trip, she packed accordingly. 2 bottles of water, 6 Nutri-Grain bars, and a loaded handgun. And she drove up to this area 4 or 5 times a week, never worrying about ghost stories or monsters. As far as she knew, these mountains were mostly harmless, with the exception of some predators that are rarely seen and the weather. But something in her changed on September 13th. Instead of going to her usual neck of the woods, she went to a remote campsite known as Hettinger, about 15 miles outside of town. It's a beautiful place where if you cross the fence, you can get up to a peak where you can see for miles. And as she's looking out over the majestic snow-covered landscape, she sees a tall, slender figure marching through the blanket of snow. Now, normally she would just ignore it as a hunter on the move, but Hettinger was pretty far away from any known hunting areas. And to this day, she wishes she would have just packed up her things and left right then. She wishes she had never peeked through her binoculars. But sometimes knowing is the only safe option. And Alex says she will never let herself forget that moment. The moment she peers through the cold glass over the winter plateau. The moment she focuses her lenses and the figure becomes clear. And she drops behind the rocks. She is 1,000 feet away or more, hidden by a rock and within the tree line. But it's looking at her as if it can see her. But that's impossible for a human. But then again, this thing, whatever it isn't human. And Alex peeks back up over the top of the rock without her binoculars to take another look. And it's just standing there, sniffing the air, looking at her. Her heart sinks and she can't move. She is frozen in fear. But she looks around her and sees that about 200 feet behind her is a small rock cave, big enough to squeeze into and deep enough to hide in the dark. So crouching down, she slowly inches her way backwards toward the entrance to the cave. And just before she's at the cave entrance, she straightens up a little bit to take one last look, and it's sprinting towards her. Alex moves as fast as she can into the cave and tucks herself in. And the moment she makes it, the creature is now standing exactly where she had just been standing. Its skin looks damp and gray, and it has really long hands with really long fingers to match that end in big, sharp, dagger-like claws. And she moves her hand to cup her mouth to cover her breathing, which is out of control. But as she moves her hand, a little rock tumbles to the frozen ground. And she looks down at the rock and snaps her head back up to see its cold eyes peering into the darkness of the cave, searching. It's almost as if it can't see her, but it knows something is there. And Alex stands as still as a statue, with her breath stuck in her chest. And it reaches in, groping around, and it almost finds her backpack. And after about 5 minutes of forever, it seems to give up and go back to just sniffing the air. And she waits there in shock, the suffocating weight of fear bearing down on her with every passing moment. Now the cave entrance quickly gets dark as night starts to fall, and the creature finally wanders off. And Alex waits a little longer to poke her head out, but when she finally does, she takes a look around and sees nothing. Like really nothing. Not only is the creature gone, but there are no footprints or tracks or anything that show it was even there. Well, she decides it is time to go. And she cautiously leaves the protection of the cave, watches her footsteps to make sure she's not making any noise, and makes her way back down to her car. And she even uses her key to unlock the door instead of using the button lock. She gets in and she sinks down and she takes one last look. She doesn't see anything. And Alex finally gets up the guts to actually start the car, puts it into reverse, and starts to exit the parking lot so she can drive down the road that will take her to the main highway. And she's just about turned around when she sees it. And it is as tall as the trees, and it is staring at her. And she hits the gas, and the car starts fishtailing on the frozen pavement. But she manages to get it going straight again and keeps driving. And as she reaches the main road, she looks in her rearview mirror and she sees that the thing is following her and keeping up. And she looks back at the road and keeps her eyes there, just focusing on driving and not crashing. And after a few miles, she looks in the mirror again and it's gone. And to this day, Alex has not been back, not even to that region of the mountains. And since that day, she has spent a lot of time figuring out what that thing was. And she found several myths about the creature and its origins. And her advice? Stay safe and know that the world is far more vast than we know. Looking for that next creepy fix? Go check out this one, and we will see you again on the In-Between.